Welcome to the third installment in this introduction to Jewish history. I'm going to skip a lot in this series because my goal is to keep it short and sweet and to give you the outline you need to understand how Jews got to be what we are today. Just like the Bible's not really trying to be a history book, though I do personally believe it is historically accurate. Rather, it collects the bits and pieces of history that help make the point it really cares about, that is, a theological narrative. So here I'm picking the bits and pieces that best explain, in the limited time we have, the Jewish people as we are today. When we left the story in the last video, the Jewish family who went down to Egypt had multiplied miraculously into a nation. Eventually their Egyptian hosts worried they would become a fifth column, joining their enemies in a time of war, and they enslaved the Jews. After about 400 years, roughly 3,500 years ago, an Egyptian prince who happened to be an Israelite comes along, has a vision, and then after plagues, high drama, and the greatest story ever told, Moses, led the Jews out of Egypt. After the Jews left Egypt and came to Mount Sinai, led by Moses, they received the Torah, that is, the teaching. The Torah is more than a religious book. It is the constitution of the Jewish people and lays out the terms of the Jewish people's special bond with God. It's like a business contract. It sets out the responsibilities of both sides and what will be the rewards and punishments, if necessary, for fulfilling or breaking the agreement. The Torah is made up of different parts. Revelation was given from God directly to Moses, first at the burning bush and then witnessed by the entire Jewish nation at Mount Sinai. The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, was written down right away and was copied with extreme care down through the ages. This text lays out the history of the world from creation until the entrance of the Jewish people into the land of Israel, and the laws by which they are to live, by which we Jewish people are to live. And just a quick note, this is an all-encompassing law. There's no differentiation made between secular and religious law because all different facets of human life are considered part of this relationship that the Jewish people has with God. The oral law was part of the same tradition, but it wasn't written down. It was also given to Moses at Sinai, and it teaches everything we need to know about how to read and interpret the written law, how to apply it to real-life situations when it might seem a little bit vague. So an example might be, how do you know that the letter A makes an ah sound, right? Somebody told you, a parent, a teacher. Otherwise you wouldn't know how to read anything, right? And of course that's before you could look up anything you wanted on YouTube. Now it's a YouTube tradition. But that was an oral tradition. And there are many things in the written Torah which are hard to know how to handle without an oral explanation. A perfect example of this is the commandment of tzitzit. How do we get from they shall make themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout their generations to the precise rules and regulations for this thing, this object in front of you, worn by every observant Jewish man? The oral tradition explains it in depth, and in the live version of this I go into more depth about how that works. This Torah, the oral part, has been passed down to us through a well-maintained chain of transmission. In part of the oral tradition, Mishnah, known as the Chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, this chain of tradition is recounted. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to the men of the Great Assembly. Now, it goes on to give a teaching from a member of each generation and then tell who they gave it to the next generation. And this tradition continues until the point at which these traditions were eventually written down, which we're going to talk about in a later video. After accepting the commandments, the Jews traveled miraculously through the desert to the land of Israel. They sinned against God at the sin of the spies and were sentenced to wander for 40 years in the desert. before they could enter the Promised Land. After 40 years, the generation that sinned was all dead except for Joshua and Caleb ben Yefuneh. So Moses held a ceremony where he passed his authority over to Joshua, and he went into the mountains to die, attended only by God. Why did Moses die, except for God, alone in the wilderness? Why didn't the Jews follow him and mark his grave for future generations? Or rather, why didn't Moses and God allow the Jews to do that? And the traditional answer is that because God knew that if the Jewish people knew where Moses was buried, we would be drawn to pray there. And if we were drawn to pray there, we would start to idolize him, to idolize Moses, that is, worshiping him as an idol. That may seem like a pretty extreme thing to fear, but I mean, the Jews just lived through one of the most miraculous periods in human history, and yet the next 1,000 years is basically the story of a battle within the Jewish people between monotheism and paganism. Please join us in the next lecture as we zip through 1,500 years of history, from the times of Joshua, the judges, and the First Temple, through the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. Thanks for joining us.